Welcome to the Joyful Nourishment Podcast. This is a podcast about our relationship with food and eating, body image, eating disorder recovery, mental health, and more. I am your host, Lynn Thorstensen, a registered nutrition therapist and body image coach based in the west of Ireland. And I'm so glad that you're here. So welcome to another episode of the Joyful Nourishment. And today I'm here with my friend and colleague, Megrette Fletcher, who I have had the pleasure of knowing for, I think, quite a number of years. I was going to say, when did I join the Centre for Mindful Eating as a member? I think around 2015 or 16. And I joined the board in 2018, so quite a while, I think. So a little bit about Megrette is that she's a registered dietitian and she's a diabetes care and education specialist. She's a public speaker and author, and she's also a mindful eating leader, and she's the co-founder of the Centre for Mindful Eating. And she also runs inclusivediabetescare.com, which is a continuing education company for professionals working to improve inclusion and health equity in diabetes care. Her focus is on decreasing stigma, which fuels her passion for weight-inclusive diabetes care, treatment, and prevention. And you're very, very welcome to my podcast, Megrette.
Thank you so much, Lynn. It's great to be here.
I wanted us to talk a little bit about, weight-inclusive diabetes care, what this looks like, maybe. But before all of that, but I really also like to ask people, I think this is my personal curiosity that takes over, is about a bit about your personal professional story journey to what got you to venture into this space of mindful eating, diabetes care, weight inclusive care.
Sure. So a long time ago, in the United States, we used to have eating disorder treatment centers where people would be for months, 2, 3, 4 months. And that was where I started. That was my first job as a dietitian. And I really loved the work. It was hard, but it was great. And I worked in a psychiatric hospital, and I worked with people with addiction and people with eating disorders. And we were together for long periods of time. And then there's something called the DRGs. They came in, and when I was working with somebody for maybe 3 months, it was like 3 days. And my job rapidly changed to putting in tube feedings or putting people on hyperalimentation. So just to gain their weight and electrolytes up. And that was just not what I was interested in. There was no conversations. So I, thought to myself, like, what field could I go into? And I said, well, I think when you have diabetes, that's a chronic illness. I'll be with them for a long time. And that was really what I wanted. I really love the relationship. And I went into diabetes care, and it was just the perfect fit for me. So I have been, I've been a dietitian for over 35 years, and I've been in diabetes for just under 30.
Okay, so quite a long time. And I don't know, like in Ireland, because of course, it's a much, much smaller population than the US. If there is any, I'm sure there are, when people are diagnosed with diabetes, either type 1 or type 2, or even a pre-diabetic, that they get some sort of care or some sort of education and steering. But I don't, as far as I know, I don't think we have any specific kind of diabetes care in the way I think that you're talking about the work that you're doing.
I'd be surprised. Diabetes affects every country, every continent. There's no place in the earth where diabetes doesn't exist. So every population has diabetes. So there's not well, these people.
No, they have it, but I think if we have any, do you, like, in your work, like, what does it look like as a diabetes educator? Like, how does the pathway work for the people that you work with?
Yeah, so in the United States, unfortunately, we have about 7 to 10% of people who are diagnosed with diabetes actually get education. So you can see 90% aren't getting it, only that 10%. So that's where the health inequity comes in. Why are some people getting care and why are other people not getting care? And there's lots of reasons why that happens. But as a diabetes educator, the provider would say, hey, your blood sugars are elevated. They're either not quite at diabetes, but they're not quite normal. That's where that pre-diabetes is. And for people that are curious, when we wake up in the morning, our blood sugar is supposed to be about 100 or below, so 99 and below. And I'll try to convert that to millimoles so you have that, because that's what it is in other countries. And then if it's below, so if it's below 99 or below, that's a normal blood sugar. If it's 100 to 126, that would be an abnormal blood sugar, but not high enough to be diabetes. So that's that kind of we're not in, we're not out. And then above 126, so it's 126 and above, is considered diabetes. And so in the past, when I started, there was one type of pill, and now we have lots. I started and there were beef and pork insulin. We don't have that anymore. We had like basically two types of insulin when I started, and now we have like, 13. So there's so many changes in the field of diabetes. People started really recognizing it's a very knowledge intensive condition and it's changing all the time. So a diabetes specialist is somebody who really works with people to try to help them understand what are my options, what can I do, how can I communicate, how can I get support. So again, the American Association talks about, it's called the ADCES 7, which is nutrition or diet, monitoring, checking our blood sugars, exercise, understanding what our risks are and reducing our risks, problem solving, coping. And then the other one that really needs to be added is technology and medication. So you can see there's a lot of different components that we're working on. And somebody might say, hey, I feel really good about my diet, but I really want to talk about monitoring, or, oh, I feel really good about exercise, but I want to talk about technology. And so we're just kind of turning around saying like, hey, I want to go talk with somebody. What would that be like? And I'm the person that lots of people get to talk to. And again, because now we're understanding that diabetes is super complex, particularly type 2 diabetes. So Dr. DeFranzo identified 12 core problems with type 2 diabetes. A lot of people think, oh, it's just what I eat. No, it's not. It's not that. It's so much more than that. People are like, well, I can fix it if I just change what I eat. No, probably not. You're still going to have it, whether you change what you eat or not. But we're trying to understand what's beneath that, what's underneath. And so now we're starting to look at, oh, my liver releases glucose when I sleep. Oh, my pancreas is functioning differently. Oh, I store fats when they differently. So we start really looking at the epigenetics, we start looking at environmental factors, we start looking at diet, exercise, body composition. There's so many things, stress, hormones, blah, blah, blah. So it goes on. And so just really letting diabetes be complex without it being scary. That's pretty much, I think, my job.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I'm just thinking about like you're talking about the complexity of it all, and it feels much more than somebody is just getting handed either a diet plan or being told to cut out all the sugars or don't do anything with that and just take the medication kind of thing. Whereas it sounds like if somebody comes to you, there's a lot of space to explore different areas across that all have their own impacts on the condition.
Absolutely. And again, it's when we think about kind of a coaching model, which is what most diabetes educators use. We're coming alongside the client. So it isn't so much do this, do that, with that finger pointing at you, kind of the teacher-student relationship. A coaching is, it's equal. And so we're turning around saying, the individual who comes and talks with me is just as knowledgeable, probably more knowledgeable about their body, and they're trying to understand the information around diabetes. And so we come as equals to share and to connect.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. And in your long career span, have you seen that changing as well, from the kind of expert client relationship to this more alongside equal that you're talking about?
I have. So again, I think what's happened is we are really starting to understand that there's a place for education. So there's a place to learn, but actually change doesn't happen by somebody learning something. It's a piece of the puzzle. It's not the whole puzzle. And so in a motivational interviewing perspective, we know that when we do something and somebody goes, hey, you did that, that's so cool, and they actually affirm the behavior, not the outcome, the behavior. Hey, that's really cool. You did this thing. You paused, you checked in with your body, and you said, what would help me now? What could help me in the future? The behavior is the pausing, the behavior is the inquiry. That's the thing that we're trying to do. When that gets acknowledged, when that gets witnessed, it actually is a thing that helps us change behavior. Versus you paused, you checked in, and then you ate so many carbohydrates, or you ate so many grams of whatever. So it might be grams of protein or fat or whatever. Actually, that's the outcome. The fact that real behavior is the pausing and it's the reflection. In a coaching perspective, we're really trying to highlight, we're trying to make that mental shift from, oh, I need to do this and I should do that and I have to do that. You can really see it's very task oriented. It's a little bit pejorative, and it's a little bit parental to, hey, what am I doing that's working? Of all the things I did today, what's helping me? That is turning around and really pulling towards the things we want to keep doing. Because if we keep focusing in on what's working, at the end of the day, we have a whole list of things that are effective. But if I'm focusing on what I didn't do and what isn't working, at the end of the day, I don't have any solutions. I just have a list of things that didn't get done and things that don't work. And I don't know about you, but I would much rather have things that I did do and things that work, because that really helps me do that more often.
Yeah, it's such a, when I hear you name it like that, it feels so obvious, but it also feels like not always the default, whether that's thinking about that piece in the middle that affects the possible outcome versus just going straight to the outcome. And it's like, oh, that was right, or that was wrong, or that was good or bad. And I feel from what you're saying also is that creating that pause or reflective space helps us to actually come back around to, when we're doing things that maybe turn out not to be so helpful, that it's easier to course correct. It feels there's more space for flexibility in coming at it from that angle, rather than being stuck in more kind of an all or nothing thinking or approach.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, to me, that black and white thinking that's what we are trained. It's either this or that. It's either right or wrong. It's either good or bad. It's either black or white. And from a mindfulness perspective, we recognize that as the binary. And, the Buddha and mindfulness teaching talks about the middle way. And so what's between this or that? What's between black and white? What's between right and wrong? What's between good and bad? That's where we're trying to put all that curiosity. What's between those two things? And I always like to say, there was an exercise that I learned somewhere along the line, is if you literally put your hand and say, oh, this is good, this is bad, and then you point to the middle, that's what you want to find, because that's really the middle way. That's really the space we want to get at. I know what the extremes are. Not very interesting, not very human, not very effective. The middle way is where I now start having that flexibility. I start having that space and playfulness. I start having the opportunity to turn around and say, yeah, I'm not trapped, I'm in charge. Very different experience for people.
Yeah, and it feels different, I think, when you receive it, right? When you're working with somebody who is supporting you in exploring what's in that middle and working and coming away from those extreme edges, there's just much more space to be curious about what is there. And I think as a facilitator or as a practitioner, I think I feel for myself, it had to unlearn a lot of that kind of thinking as well, or thinking about if your client isn't responding to what you think they ought to be doing, well, then that's on them and that's a problem, versus being able to explore, okay, what did you learn from that experiences? And what were the things that you noticed throughout trying this on or doing that or not doing that? And there's much more space for learning for everybody involved, I think.
Yeah, sure. And as you were talking, what I heard you described as compassionate curiosity.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's something important, I think, for all of us to try to bring into our work and towards and for ourselves as well. And for then, like, what kind of like when somebody comes to you, what is the typical things that they would ask for support with? What are the things that tends to show up in somebody who's just maybe gotten a diagnosis or been told by their physician or provider that, okay, your blood sugar is elevated, you need to do something about that? So how do people like when they arrive for a conversation with you, like what tends to be pressing then?
Sure. Well, I think right now, again, I started a long time ago, pre-internet. And so before there was really a knowledge deficit. And so I think when people initially started to see me, they were like, well, what am I supposed to know? But now we have Dr. Google, and Dr. Google is pretty much everyone's like, I looked it up, I know what to do. Knowing and doing are not the same thing. And so what happens is a lot of people come up and they're like, well, I know what to do. And I'm like, what would that be? And they will say things like, oh, I need to do X, Y, and Z. And I go, okay, how did you feel when X, Y, and Z happened? And they're like, what? And I'm like, well, when you took that medicine, how did you feel? You know, what came up? Did you have more energy? Did you have less energy? Did you have, how were your bowels? How was your sleep patterns? What were your blood sugars? And they're like, I don't know. And I go, so we can learn, but then we have to apply that learning to us. And that's really where, I feel like working with somebody who's knowledgeable about diabetes is so helpful. And just again, it's this kind of case in point where people will tell me things and I'll say, yep, that's pretty much what we would expect, or nope, that's outside of those expectations. Give me some more information. Why do you think that's happening? Or let's talk to your provider, because I feel like they should know that this is what is occurring with you. So in a lot of ways, when people show up, they have the knowledge, but they don't know how to apply it. So they have the factual information, but they're really not sure of how to apply it. And so they'll say things like, yeah, I went to the doctor because I was really tired. And I was like, yeah, that could be diabetes. And they're like, oh, but I found out my thyroid was low. And I'm like, yep, that could be thyroid. And they're like, do you think they're related? Yep, they can be. So, so this is the thing. I don't know if it is related for you, but we do know that a lot of times people with thyroid dysfunction also get diabetes. And again, there's lots of reasons why that happens. Could be aging, could be that they also have an autoimmune disease like Hashimoto's. It could be changes in activity that they just, they're just because their thyroid's low, they're not as active as they used to be. There's lots of reasons why these things happen. And our job isn't to say, oh, this is what caused that. It's, well, could it be? What else could it be? And again, that compassionate curiosity of trying to understand, what am I experiencing? I have the information, but I don't understand what my experience is. And again, that pausing, that slowing down really helps us connect with the whole being, the whole person.
Mm. Yeah. And I'm thinking about when people, somebody might listen to this podcast, either, have, high blood sugars, or, latest blood shown that, or know somebody with type 2 diabetes, and it feels like, okay, right, if you've got diabetes, you need to, high blood sugars, too many carbohydrates, too much sugar in the blood, right? That is part of what it is. But it's like, well, if I'm eating a lot of sugar, I need to just take that all out. And it just feels like that's kind of like that feels like a sort of a blanket message that is there. And having spoken to somebody who does a lot of work with type 1 diabetics, she's like, you don't really work like that anymore either. But I can see her face kind of changing when I'm saying that. So I'm kind of curious to hear if somebody's been told, like, just cut out all the carbohydrates or the carbs. Like, if I came to you and said, okay, my physician says my blood sugars are elevated, and they just said, you need to cut down on the carbs. So now I'm feeling like, I can't eat bread, I can't have chocolate, I can't have cakes, ice cream, all the nice things that I like. What am I going to do? Should I take out fruit, grains? What am I supposed to be eating?
And again, here we go back to, how do I apply information? And so what is the application? So there's like a little exercise that I did, and I find it really, really helpful. I'll say to somebody, can you name 10 foods you hate? And they go, yeah, I don't like mushrooms. I don't like liver. And they list it out really, really quickly. And I go, okay, tell me 10 foods you love. And they go, ice cream, cake, watermelon. And then they can't get there. So we have this natural bias towards being afraid we're going to have to eat the foods we don't like. And we're terrified that people are going to take away the foods we love. When we pause and we slow down, we start recognizing, oh, there's a lot of foods that I don't like, more foods that we don't like. That's normal. There's not as many foods that I love that I thought about. So that those edges, but there's a lot of foods that are very neutral, just a lot of foods that are super neutral. And so we start recognizing, oh, well, how about if I start there? How about if I start focusing in on the foods that I'm kind of like meh about? So, if you're not super excited about lima beans and you're not like, oh my gosh, lima beans are my favorite, you might turn around and say, oh, lima beans have carbohydrates in them. Okay, good to know. It's not really impacting my diet very much. So, but I'm aware. Oh, okay. What other things have carbohydrates to them? Oh, well, I don't eat a lot of farro. Okay, good, good. But I could eat that. That I hear that's a whole grain. Oh, okay, where am I getting my carbohydrates from? What does my diet look like as a baseline? We just want to start with that. What are you eating? Focusing in on foods that nourish your body, not targeting the foods you hate or the foods you love, but the stuff in the middle, to turn around and say, like, how do you feel about Would you be interested? Could you consider eating this? And then people start turning around and saying like, oh, I get it. If I wanted to have, this food, and let's just say rice, the question isn't, can't I have rice? The question is, how can I have rice and keep my blood sugar stable? So we're not taking away foods. We're asking you to think about how can you balance your plate so the foods that you love are part of that meal and the foods that you don't want to eat are not part of that meal. And there's an awareness about all the foods in between. And you're like, oh, I never really thought about that food. I didn't really realize that food could make my blood sugar go up. And that's how we're really trying to learn about diabetes. So this idea of you can't eat, you're not allowed to eat, you shouldn't eat, that's again that hierarchical parental. So someone is telling you, the adult, what you can and can't do. No matter how you slice that, it will wake up your inner teenager. Your inner teenager is going to grab the steering wheel of your life, and there's a high probability it will not go in a good place. There is a high probability if your inner teenager is driving your life, it may not be going so great.
Yeah, that's probably a reason why we grow out of adolescence at some point and we don't stay there forever. But I love what you said. The question is not about what you can or cannot have. The question is about how can you include the foods that you love and keep your blood sugar stable. That's a very, very different question and a very, very different angle or aspect to come at it from.
Yeah. And I think slowing down helps us do that. Slowing down helps us start moving out of the force or familiar. So if it's familiar for me to tell myself you can't have and you shouldn't have, because I lived in diet culture. You're not allowed, you shouldn't eat, that's bad, don't eat too much. You can start hearing how this is a lot of shoulds and shouldn'ts and not allowed. It's actually a very fear-based model. And we're dealing with the force of familiar. The force of familiar is a little bit of a brain cramp, but it goes like this. Things that are familiar attract us. They don't warn us. We don't go, oh, this is bad. We go, oh no, I can't be wrong. It's familiar. So that force of familiar is pulling us back. So if it's familiar to be afraid of food, it would be familiar to think about diabetes, and it would be familiar to be afraid of diabetes. If it's familiar for you to tell yourself, I can eat this and I can't eat that, it would be very familiar for you to take on the same approach in diabetes. It's because it's familiar. This is how I've learned in the past. This is what I've been told in the past. This is how people have interacted with me in the past. Why would I try something new? This way is familiar.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. And that leads me to my next question. Like, how does mindfulness and mindful eating then fit into the care? Because I think this is kind of also what you're talking about, this slowing down, the sense of curiosity, open up space for possibility to, for the unfamiliar to maybe become familiar.
Right, exactly. And so when we think about mindfulness, we have to have, in order for change to happen, there has to be an amount of unfamiliar. Familiar is comforting. I know it. I'm not worried. It's familiar. Unfamiliar, a lot of times is kind of, it makes me nervous. Like, I don't know. I'm unsure. I'm afraid. All the boop, boop, boop warning lights are going off because it's unfamiliar. If you always do what's familiar, you're never going to change. You have to lean into the unfamiliar. And so mindfulness helps us do that and stretch and find that balance of unfamiliar that's sustainable, that compassionate curiosity, that growth mindset versus too far in the extreme. It's too unfamiliar. It's not sustainable. And I think that goes back to that fear of people say, I'm diagnosed with diabetes. They're going to tell me to give up all carbohydrates. No.
Yeah.
That would be unfamiliar. That would be unsustainable. We're not going to say that. That's our fear, and our fear is familiar. Dieting tells us you can't eat. Dieting tells us you're not allowed. So that's familiar. So when I go to see my doctor, that's what my doctor or that's what my provider is going to say. Many providers don't say that. Most providers don't say that, but it's what we hear.
Mm.
So I went to the doctor. They told me I have diabetes. I went to my provider. They told me I have diabetes and like I can't eat carbohydrates. And I'm like, did they say that? Well, I mean, yeah. They said those exact words. Well, no, but I mean, I know that I can't eat that stuff anymore. Like I'm not allowed. That's familiar. It's fear. It's the familiar fear. And so mindfulness is turning around and saying, let's just bring it down a little bit. Let's focus in on the breathing. Where is that fear landing in your body? And as we're talking, it's right here in my chest. I can put my hand on it because mindfulness helps us understand the difference between thoughts and feelings. So we think our thoughts and we feel our feelings. You can't feel a thought. You can think a thought, but you can't feel a thought.
Mm.
And if you're having a feeling about diabetes, you're feeling your feelings. Can't think them, you feel them. And so as I help people with mindfulness start differentiating those two things, we think our thoughts, we feel our feelings. And it's so simple, but a lot of people try to feel their thoughts. And I go, no, no, no. We can't feel our thoughts. We think our thoughts. We feel our feelings. And they go, whoa, I really feel like I'm thinking my feelings. And I go, it's familiar, isn't it? And they go, yeah. I go, right. And we need to break out of the force of familiar and get into the little bit of the unfamiliar in a comfortable way. But when you start really listening and you say, oh, what am I feeling? Feelings are within the body. Hunger is within the body. Pain is within the body. Anxiety, tension, stress, all of those things manifest in the body. We can feel them. When I'm anxious, I can feel it. Sometimes it's in my stomach, sometimes it's in my chest, sometimes it's up the back of my neck, sometimes it's just like behind my eyes. Like I feel things in my body. Mindfulness is saying, oh, don't say it, don't start a story, Megrette. Just be with your physical experience. That's your feelings. You're feeling your feelings. Oh, so this feeling in my stomach, it could be hunger or it could be anxiety. I could be feeling my anxiety physically in my stomach. I could be feeling worry or fear physically in my body. Could be feeling anxiety physically in my body. That's where mindfulness really helps us separate out thoughts, think our thoughts, and we feel our feelings. And when we practice mindfulness, it's hard. And so when we do it around eating and we eat mindfully and we're like, I take a bite, I'm going to really try to be present with that. I'm going to notice how it feels in my body. I'm going to try to, if I'm thinking about food, I'm just going to try to say, oh, I'm thinking about food. But right now I'm going to eat and I'm going to be in my body. And my body's going to change and the sensations in my body are going to change. And there's a high probability I'm going to enjoy eating more. And if I don't enjoy eating, if the food doesn't taste good or I'm not enjoying it for whatever reason, there's a higher probability I would stop eating because I would know that I'm not enjoying this. Put it in my mouth and I go, it doesn't taste good. This is not a good experience. I'm more able to stop eating than if I was mindless. And either way, eating, not eating, stopping, starting, I'm in charge. I'm the person in charge. So mindful eating is just this lovely, small practice moment for us to be in our body, for us to feel our feelings. And a lot of times it comes with a delicious reward of yummy food or the fabulous outcome of not eating foods we don't like.
Yeah. I think that's often such a revelation for people, that it turns out that stuff that they thought that they really liked, that felt even controlling. It's like, turns out I actually don't really like it. That's not the reason I'm eating it. It's either I shouldn't be having it, so I'm the teenager is in there driving the bus or the van or whatever, the car, and I'm like, actually, I don't really like it. Or it turns out that things are really tasty. That you're surprised, yeah. Or that sometimes it's just neutral and we have to eat anyway. That's also part of it, right? And you also talk and you write, you have two newsletters on Substack, where this podcast also live. One is on, remind me again, weight inclusive diabetes care. And then the other one is weight loss is not required. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's inclusive diabetes care, and that's looking at health equity issues. So kind of my space that I have, and this is, obviously I don't have any research to back this up, but I think the diet narrative, diet culture has infiltrated diabetes care in a way that has that's harming people with diabetes. And when I say it's harming, the focus is no longer on diabetes and the needs of people with diabetes and ways to make people's lives better with diabetes and acknowledging the difficulty people with diabetes have. The focus is now about getting people with diabetes to lose weight. And I go, so I'm trying to highlight that, to turn around and say, no.
Yeah.
No, they need affordable medicine. They need access to technology. We need better technologies. We need more integrations. We need more providers, better education. We need access. We need less stigma, non-judgment. There's all this stuff that we need that have nothing to do with weight loss. But right now, weight loss is the dominant conversation. And weight loss, because it's so profitable, the target market is a smaller percentage of educated, affluent, and typically straight-sized people. And so that leaves off everyone else. And everyone else is a lot of people. And so we start seeing the health inequities. And when we see health inequities, it's suffering. And suffering is very hard to witness. And our reaction in the United States is to blame those that suffer. Well, they shouldn't have done that. They shouldn't have eaten that. They should have taken better care of themselves. And so now we're blaming someone who's suffering. And that makes us feel good, the people in charge, because, well, it's not my fault. It's not my organization. It's not my institution. It's them, those people, nameless humans that, like, I don't even know where they are. And I'm like, they're in your neighborhood. They're the person next to you at work. They're not nameless. They have a face. They have needs. They have family. Like, they're someone's kid. They're probably someone's parent. Like, these are people. These are our neighbors, and they're not nameless. And diabetes is super complex. So inclusive diabetes care is just really untangling all that stigma that surrounds diabetes. And I've identified 7 types of stigma that I focus in on, including weight, including health, gender, ability, economics, education. There's all these different kinds of stigma that we're dealing with, and diabetes stigma for sure, and how they intersect. And there's a lot of intersectionality. And so fat bodies really get the brunt of it. And our institutions and our societies are also affected by the force of familiar. So if it's familiar to blame and offload, then that's what they're going to do. If it's familiar to treat people that are straight sized, that's what they're going to do. It's the force of familiar. It affects everyone and everything. The other newsletter is for consumers. It's called No Weight Loss Required. And I'm really talking to people with prediabetes and diabetes. And we're just trying to understand the information without dragging weight into this. And so it's really turning around saying, what can we do? And if we don't put weight on the table, what are our options?
Yeah. And I feel there's two things that come up for me when I'm listening to you talk about both of your different newsletters around the health equity and the blaming those people. It also feels like, I mean, I see it here in Ireland as well. We sometimes, like with public health campaigns, it's often, well, we tell people what they should be doing. So of course, that's what part you talked about earlier, like the education piece, but that doesn't necessarily, mean that anything's going to change. But it feels like, well, we told them what they should be doing without considering any of the systems that possibly impact of why they're not doing that already.
Or why they can't do that. Or
why
why
they
that
can't do
changes
that.
out of it. Right.
Yeah. Why that's not
I
possible.
told
because
them
things aren't
already.
Yeah.
Right.
We're done.
I told them already, my job is done.
Yeah. And now we can
There's no
bring it
compassion
back.
in that.
No. And it's easy then, we can bring it back to blaming individuals for systemic problems that are much bigger and that are more in the potential power of, policymakers and politicians and so forth. But anyway, if that's not a kind of a willingness to look at the systemic impacts, it's just like you said, wipe your hands. We told them what they should be doing, and if they're not doing that, well, that's not my problem, or that's not my fault. They're educated, they got a leaflet. So that makes me quite, like, just I feel like it's such a cop out from that perspective. And then the other thing, when you're talking about the weight piece, is, a few conversations I've already had with different people on this podcast around health and weight and physical health or illness, that, like, how difficult could it be to just not drag weight into it every time? Like you've just said, there's like 7, 8, 9 different things that potentially play into supporting somebody with diabetes. What's weight got to do with it, right? Like, I mean, of course, the less naive part of me, of course, understands what you already did mention. It's like, because I was going to ask, what's the question? Why do you think it is that they're all of a sudden, weight just becomes such a focus? But you said, well, it's really profitable. So that's there. But it's really good, I think, for people to know, hopefully, to highlight the work that you do, that it doesn't have to be the main thing that they have to focus on in order to support themselves if they have diabetes or even pre-diabetes.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah, there's a lot to that. So I'm going to link to your newsletters and your writing and resources in the show notes for anybody who wants to go and check it out, or know somebody who could really be helped by the work that you're doing, Megrette. And as we're coming to a close, I would like to ask you, what does joyful nourishment mean to you?
So to me, it's compassion. It's just really turning around and bringing that compassion back into food and eating. And compassion is it's a very flexible concept. And I always love to think about compassion has a wisdom aspect to it. Compassion has a self-kindness aspect to it. Compassion has a curiosity to it. But compassion is that thing that I think I didn't know. I think it was the learning that I always wanted. And that's why I'm so focused in on it. So when I can eat something and compassion is present in every bite, I really like it a lot more.
Yeah, so powerful. And I feel like there's a whole conversation to be had around compassion, because I find sometimes I bring it up with people and they're like, oh, but I would just let myself off the hook, or I would just, like, yeah, sure, I could be nice to myself, but like then I wouldn't, I would stop caring, or I wouldn't, you know, and it feels like it's like maybe I'm not doing a good enough job to help people for this to land in the way, but that my intention is for people, where it feels kind of like almost like, well, that's for other people. It's not for me, for myself. I can't, or that it's, or the sense also sometimes that it's too overwhelming. It's like to bring that level of kindness and care towards oneself. It's so overwhelming that it's almost like it's no, I can't go there. It's too much. It's too much.
Yeah. And if you say it slightly differently, if I can edit,
Mm-hmm.
it's
Please.
too unfamiliar.
That's a really good, yeah, that makes sense. It's too unfamiliar.
Yeah. It's
That's not the
unfamiliar.
deep.
Right. And when people are with you, Lynn, you're modeling compassion, you're modeling active listening, you're modeling all those things. And people will turn around and say, I don't know, she's kind of weird. I don't know. This is like a really strange appointment. I mean, they like didn't give me a diet, and I don't know. And that isn't saying you did anything wrong. It's just too unfamiliar to have somebody really listen to them. It's too unfamiliar to have somebody come alongside you and work with you as a peer. That can be very unfamiliar for lots of people. And so
Mm.
they need to kind of be with that a little bit longer before they're like, no, that was really familiar and I'm in. I love it. It was such a supportive conversation. It was so helpful to have somebody really help me understand what I want or what I'm trying to do, because I do get caught up in the familiar of diet culture. I do get caught up in the craving. I do get caught up in the expectation. And when I'm with Lynn, I'm able to let that go. I'm able to slow down. I'm able to really start checking in. That starts becoming familiar. Compassion for many of us. What's that again? I don't know. I've never really seen that before. It's
Yeah.
unfamiliar.
Yeah. No, that's so true. I love that. Thanks for that, Megrette, for thinking about. I think for me, I'm taking that away from our conversations today. The force of familiar and things being unfamiliar. And that can be a big reason why it's like, oh, this is unfamiliar, so I don't know what to do with it. And I remember somebody said to me years ago, she's like, this is a colleague, and she said, like, I don't understand this word self-compassion. Like, I don't understand. But English wasn't her first language either, and she's like, I don't understand. Like, what is that? Like, never heard of it, and it was so unfamiliar that the word, like the whole concept, was just quite incomprehensible. That was even a thing that was like you could think about or that could be possible. It just was never even come across the word in it itself. And I don't think that this person's experience is unique. We hear about it more, I think, through the amplification of social media, but and I mean, some people probably have it modeled, and before I knew what it was or compassion, I could definitely name experiences of that without, naming it compassion or compassionate, being compassionately witnessed or cared for in that. But when we receive it, including from ourselves, I think we feel it.
Yes. And that feeling is, in fact, it lands in our body. Compassion is a physical experience within the body. We can think about compassion, but we can experience compassion. And when we can feel it in our body, that I think is when the switch gets flipped.
I agree. I think this is a perfect place to end. So, Megrette, where can people find you if they want to go and check out the good work you do in the world?
Sure. So I'm very lucky to have an unusual name. So if people go to megrette.com, all the links to my newsletters and websites are all on my website. So that's the easiest place. If people want to work with me one-on-one, I see people individually through a company called Nourish. But my newsletters, both newsletters are free. So really a very low threshold. If you'd like to listen to my voice, it is a reading. I don't do a podcast like Lynn, but I do write a lot, so you can read about it.
Excellent. And I'll put all of those links into the show notes. And thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. The Joyful Nourishment podcast is produced with no financial backing, and your support means a lot to keep this project going. If this episode has been helpful in any way, please consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on. This helps the podcast to be found by others. And of course, you can also forward this episode to a friend whom you think may benefit. Find out more about what I offer on straightforwardnutrition.com, and if you're interested in working with me, please use the link in the show notes to book in for a free initial 30-minute session. And finally, please come and join the Joyful Nourishment community over on Substack, unless you're there already, by subscribing to my newsletter using the link below.